Hello, I'm Tom with a list of interesting things. All of the things on these lists are wonderful. Nothing that's on these lists gets a spot unless it sparks joy or interest or excitement. Today I want to talk about something that's rather horrible, something called the spoiler effect, often called vote splitting, and sometimes inaccurately called the spoiler myth. The spoiler effect is the effect third-party candidates can have on an election. Today we're going to discuss the spoiler effect, go through some of the things that it can do, discuss some of the potential reasons why it exists, and then, on the list of interesting things, discuss one potential solution to deal with it. Let's dive right in. Let's suppose that we ignore everything that happened at the end of Game of Thrones, and instead we suppose that everyone came together and decided to have an election. Not the election that they had, a real election. Let's suppose that we have two major political parties, the Lions and the Northmen. The Northmen have controlled the Seven Kingdoms for the last two election cycles, with a fairly popular candidate, Ned Stark. He's a proponent of greater freedom for individual kingdoms. He's not radical, but rather employs moderation and peaceful compromise to work with politicians and appeal to voters of the other side. For the last two election cycles, he has beat out Cersei Lannister, the Lions candidate, whose policy positions include increased power for the Iron Throne and stricter dragon ownership regulations. The elections were somewhat divisive, garnering a ton of attention. The margin ended up being 56-44 in favor of the Northmen 4 years ago. Decisive, but certainly not a blowout. Right now, a relatively large minority are unhappy with the way that things are being run, with some supporters of the Northmen being unsatisfied that changes that they want to happen are not happening fast enough. In the current election, some of the electorate decides to start a new party, the Northern Remembrance Party. They get a fair amount of support for their new candidate, Sansa Stark, who has been similarly dissatisfied with her father's perceived moderation and capitulation. She supports greater freedom for the individual kingdoms, sometimes even flirting with the desire for independence in places like Winterfell and Sunspear. The Northmen and the NRP have very similar goals, and their policies are almost always aligned. Keep that in mind because it's going to be important. The election comes and goes and turnout is very high given the energy surrounding the race. Sansa Stark, with her newfound popularity and her family name, gains an impressive amount of support for a first-time candidate. She garners more than 18% of the vote. Much of that coming from voters who would have supported the Northmen in the past, but want to see change happen faster. Ned Stark, being already quite a popular incumbent, gets 39% of the vote. Lion voters, however, were not swayed by Ned Stark's pro-individual kingdom rhetoric, and certainly weren't swayed by Sansa's extremist independence stance. So they carry right on voting for the Lions candidate, Cersei Lannister. When all the votes are counted, it's Sansa Stark 18, Ned Stark 39, and Cersei Lannister 43. And so Cersei Lannister takes the Iron Throne, in spite of the fact that most people of the Seven Kingdoms didn't vote for her. I'm going to say that again. She takes the Iron Throne in spite of the fact that most people in the Seven Kingdoms voted for somebody else. Now, this may seem extreme, but in the United States, we do sometimes see very real examples of this. For example, in 1912, the esteemed and illustrious Teddy Roosevelt, a subject for another video, had served nearly 2 full terms as president after the death of William McKinley. He served from 1901 to 1909, and in the election of 1908 he did the Washingtonian thing and chose not to run for re-election. Roosevelt threw his endorsement behind his own Secretary of War, today known as the Secretary of Defense, William Howard Taft. Taft became the Republican Party nominee and easily defeated ever candidate, never president, and noted member of the most interesting lawyers of all time, William Jennings Bryan. He might be an interesting thing for another day, too. I mean, look at that handsome face, how could we not? Taft took office in March of 1909, but over the course of his first term, he and Roosevelt grew apart. Taft started to take some policy positions that Roosevelt disagreed with, and when Taft ran for re-election in 1912, Teddy challenged him for the Republican Party nomination. Roosevelt lost at the Republican convention, but decided to carry on in the race anyway, founding his own progressive party, commonly nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. When Election Day rolled around, no candidates got a majority of the popular vote, and Taft and Roosevelt, both being Republican, largely split the Republican vote between them. Sorry about this image quality, by the way. It was the only popular vote breakdown I could find for 1912. This map comes via the Geospatial and Statistical Data Center at the University of Virginia, by the way. Roosevelt and Taft were both very popular, and if it had been only one of them running, they might have united the Republican wing and managed to take a majority in states like New York and New Jersey, where the winner won with only 41% of the vote. They might have prevented Woodrow showed Confederate propaganda films in the White House Wilson from winning the presidency with only 42% of the vote overall. 42%, meaning 58% of people voted against him. This is the spoiler effect in action. Even disregarding electoral college shenanigans, which are a whole other can of worms, it allows candidates to be elected with a minority of votes. Am I saying that if Taft had dropped out, that all of supporters would have voted for Roosevelt? No, absolutely not. Am I saying that if Roosevelt had dropped out, they all would have broken for Taft? Definitely not. I'm sure that some of them would have voted for Woodrow actively attempted to take over the world Wilson. But many of those voters, probably most of them, would have voted for Teddy or Taft because they were in the same party, served together in the same administrations, and shared comparable policy positions on most issues. Voters, especially third-party voters, really don't like talking about this kind of thing, and for obvious reasons. It's commonly called vote shaming. But unfortunately, this issue is a necessary consequence of the voting system that we have. It's called first-past-the-post voting. In first-past-the-post, the winner is the one who gets a plurality, not a majority. And that's a huge problem, because in races with many tens of candidates, you can end up having elected officials in office who are only elected by single-digit numbers of voters. Now, the spoiling issue is not a problem with the political parties, although they don't help, and in some cases they actively exacerbate it. The problem is also not with the voters. The problem is with first-past-the-post voting itself. That's why I present, on the list of interesting things, a solution. Something that makes voting more fair, more representative, and eliminates the spoiler effect altogether. Coming in at number 1,331 on the list of interesting things, ranked choice voting. Sometimes called instant runoff voting, ranked choice voting is an alternative voting method. It's not the only alternative voting method, nor is it necessarily the best, but it is the most intuitive. Just like first past the post, ranked choice is very easy to understand. Simply put, instead of each voter going to the polls and selecting one candidate, they instead go in and rank their candidates in order of who they prefer. The race proceeds as normal, but after the election, if no candidate has a majority, the candidate with the lowest vote total is removed from the rotation and their votes are redistributed to their voters' second choice. If after that round, still no candidate has a majority, then the next lowest candidate is dropped, and so on until eventually somebody breaks 50%. Let's return to our hypothetical Westerosi election, but this time we'll use ranked choice. The election turns out the same, with Sansa at 18, Ned at 39, and Cersei at 43. Under first past the post, Cersei would become leader, but in ranked choice, Sansa would then be eliminated, and her votes would be redistributed among the remaining candidates. Let's say that 18% of her voters, the original number, 3 of those put Cersei as their second choice, and 15 of those put Ned as their second choice. The votes are accordingly redistributed, and Ned ends up winning with a margin of 54 to 46. This voting method and others like it are wonderful because they protect third-party candidates. In modern politics, voters who really like the Green Party wouldn't need to worry about voting for them and risk actively hurting the Democratic candidate, who might share most of their views. Similarly, Conservative Party voters don't need to worry about supporting their favorite candidate because they can put the Republican candidate as their second choice. It ensures that, barring any electoral college shenanigans, which are a topic for another video, no candidate is ever elected with a minority of votes. No votes are ever wasted, and we never end up with Woodrow consistently throws journalists in jail Wilson again. I encourage you to subscribe to stay up to date on all the most interesting things. I'll be doing plenty more government and politics issues in the near future. Check back for those as we head toward the election. So until next time, be like ranked choice voting. be wise, and be flexible, and be accepting of those who are new and those who are different. And above all, be interesting. See you next time.